All right. Hi, everybody. I am Aiden. This is Aiden again. I am recording a second video for this channel. Um, During the first video, I kind of gave some guidance on how to get involved in playing some online chess yourself and maybe starting to analyze your own positions. In this video, I am gonna get into a little bit of the kind of lexicon, the language of chess, and sort of get you familiarized with some terms that are used in the chess community and used to describe certain chess positions and certain tactics and motifs within games. Um, I think moving forward, this will help, especially beginners, just to understand what people are talking about when you're watching a video online. So right now, as you can see here, I am using the Lichess board editor. This is not the same as the analysis board. As you'll notice, there's not the chess engine stockfish as in the last video. So in this position, I could, literally take a pawn off the board and put one back on and do whatever I want to the board and just play with it and show you guys some various different things. So, um, one of the terms that I used in the last video without really explaining what it was, and maybe is a good place to start off, is the term fork. A lot of you guys will probably know what that means, but let's say, for example, that we have a position something like this, and I don't know, let's put a knight here, and let's have white bring a knight out, and like this, and let's put this knight here. Now, what you might notice is that white is now threatening to take this pawn, and that would come with what we call a fork. And the reason we call it a fork is because the knight would be double attacking, right? The king and the rook. So let's say black made a silly move like bishop g7 here. Then the knight would take the c7 pawn with check, and there'd be no way for black to avoid losing his rook. And as we know, knights are less good than rooks. Um, anyway, that's what a fork is, right? A fork can also come from other pieces as well. Let's say, for example, that, I don't know, we've got a knight here, and we have a bishop over here, and let's just say it's white's turn, and there's a rook here. I'll give you guys a second, but what's the way to fork these two pieces? Well, that would be with rook c4. And as you can see, this rook's attacking the knight and the bishop. And there's no way for black to avoid losing one of those pieces. If black moves the knight, then we take the bishop. If black moves the bishop, then we take the knight. So these are tactical motifs that are important to understand and look out for in your games. Okay, so yeah, that's a fork. Obviously, I also just want to start out by saying any feedback or questions you might have, please feel free to leave in the comments section, because as this whole coronavirus situation happens, I'll probably be making more and more videos, and I want to tailor them to what you guys want to learn about. So, be it new openings that you might be interested in, or new kinds of tactics, or just whatever comes to your mind, please leave a comment. Anyway, so that's a fork. Pretty simple. Another super important concept in chess is what we call a pin. Often, um, we even have the expression "pin to win," right? Because pinning can often lead to winning. So in this position, if it was White's turn to move, a potential option for White would be to play Bishop to G5. And now, as you can see, this is what we call a pin. Basically, this knight cannot move without what happening? Well, the queen losing, right? Without losing the queen. Let's say the knight tries to jump in here, then we just take the queen, and that'll end up being game over, right? So, often pins come with a lot of consequences, right? If black doesn't do something quick to alleviate the pressure of that pin, like in this position right here, I mean, normally there'd probably be like a pawn here as well, and a knight here, and, some types of moves. But anyway, if black doesn't play bishop here to alleviate the pin, black could quickly be in a lot of problems. So let's say, for example, black just plays, I don't know, knight a6. Well, white could push the e5 pawn, and suddenly this knight is under attack from a pawn, which is obviously weaker than a knight, and we would happily trade a pawn for the knight any day. But there's not really much to be done about it, right? If we move the knight, what happens? We lose the queen, and therefore the game. So, yeah, you really got to watch out for pins. They can be quite forcing. Other variations of that term, sometimes we call a pin a skewer. That's normally when you're attacking a stronger piece, right? So, for example, this knight and bishop are worth about the same, as we know, right? So trading the bishop for the knight would actually not be a great idea because you give the queen a free move like this. But let's say that knight were a rook. A rook is considerably more valuable than a bishop. So now, by that same logic, if we bring our bishop to g5 here, we've got what's called a skewer. Because now, again, the rook is pinned to the queen, so the rook doesn't want to move, but inevitably we're going to take that rook, right? Obviously, we can't move the rook because we'll lose the queen. That's even worse. But whatever move black makes, I mean, even here, white doesn't have to take the rook yet because that pin is so strong that it's not going to leave, right? So let's say white gets a free move like, let's say they bring their knight out. Now let's say black moves their queen away so that it's no longer pinned. Now we can take the rook. And that's just really good for white. These are all just little tactical motifs that you want to look out for in your games. A lot of the positions that I'm going to be putting on the board during this video are pretty nonsensical and would never occur in a real game. Okay. Some other of my favorite types of tactical motifs involve mating attacks. So let's put a king over here, and let's turn this bishop into a rook, and, pretend this looks kind of plausible as if black may have castled, and maybe there was a bishop fianchettoed meaning placed on this long diagonal at some point during the game, and now black's got this weakness on the dark squares here. So one plan for white might just be to push h4, h5, h6, this kind of thing. And you can imagine that, let's say this bishop was actually a queen, if we can achieve h6 and black doesn't deal with the threats, let's say a move like knight c5. I'll give you a second. But there is a completely winning move here for white. It might not be totally obvious to someone who's unfamiliar with the game, but this is these weaknesses on these dark squares you can see, as black doesn't have a dark squared bishop and the pawns are all on light squares, right? Basically, white can just play queen f6, and no matter what black does, the next move is going to be queen to g7 checkmate, right? The pawn protects the square, and there's just no defense. If this rook were already here, then black might have a little bit of a chance, right? He could play king f8, and the queen could come to g7 or h8, and he could escape over here. But the fact that the rook is trapping his own king makes it impossible to save this game, or this position. Let's see. What are some other good tactical motifs here? Another way that a fork can arise is with a pawn. Pawns are often misjudged as being really weak pieces, and no doubt they are the weakest pieces on the board, but they do determine the whole structure of the game. And there are a lot of times when a subtle pawn move that someone might not expect can end up winning the game. Let's say, for example, we get some type of pretty standard position with knight c6 and let's say bishop c4, and perhaps bishop c5. Okay, already there is this theme. I don't think tactically it maybe works specifically in this position, but just to highlight the nature of what I'm talking about. Yeah, this bishop would have to move first. But anyway, so let's say this knight takes this pawn. On the surface, that looks like just a horrible move because we're giving away a knight for free. But here we go. Pawn to d4. And suddenly we're attacking the bishop and the knight. So these themes arise in these e4 type positions often. And it's always good to look out for a subtle pawn push. Another little thing that I wanted to mention, just for some, I'm trying to make these videos sort of universal. Obviously, this is going to be sort of an irrelevant video for a player of any real caliber. But if you're getting started with the game, it's just good to get familiar with the way that we talk about the game. So, for example, if I play e4, my opponent plays e5, I play knight f3. Now, let's say my opponent plays knight c6. I have this option of playing bishop to b5, and basically this is, I mentioned this in the last video, it's called the Rui Lopez, and it is a pretty maneuvering, kind of slow, maneuver your pieces to better squares type of positional game. So we might consider this position to be kind of dull, for example. For example, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, maybe d6, c, or let's say c3, and then there exist all these plans for both the black and the white side where black wants to get his bishop out and castle, and white wants to either play d3 or d4 in one move, followed by something like rook e1, knight to d2, and then knight to f1, and then knight to g3 or to e3. And you can see how these are sort of long maneuvering plans here. They take quite a bit of time, but both sides get some of what they want. Maybe they'll have to compromise, but there's not a whole lot of trading going on. As you can see, all the pieces are still on the board, right? Whereas, let's say we started off this game in a different manner. Let's say that instead of playing, when I play knight f3, instead of responding with knight c6 here, my opponent played knight f6. Suddenly, the position can become what we say is very sharp, as opposed to these kind of dull maneuvering games. Basically, the game's going to be a lot more about calculating and understanding the ramifications of move by move understandings of the position. So, for example, we could obviously take this pawn, in which case black would kick our knight away. There's a lot of different variations here, but I think the most popular at the highest level is just to play knight back to f3, and we can get this kind of symmetrical position. I think bishop d3 has been played here, but also queen e2 as well as d3, and they're quite sharp positions. And so a lot of times in videos moving forward, you might hear me talk about a position being closed or open or sharp or dull or maneuvering or tactical or positional, those kinds of things. And I'm just trying to familiarize you guys with those kinds of words, that kind of chess language. Let me give you a good example of a closed position here. So, again, arising from e4, but this time, instead of playing e5, if our opponent plays the French defense, that's what this is called, this pawn to e6, I can play d4, grabbing the center. The logical move is to strike back in the center with d5, and now white has a choice. White can play a sort of cagey kind of move with either knight d2 or knight c3, protecting this pawn. Or white can take the pawn, making a symmetrical structure that becomes kind of a move-by-move situation. Or often in my youth, I played a lot of this move, e5, and this creates what we would call the advanced variation, and this is a closed structure. As you can see, I just closed off the position, right? So the natural move here for black is c5, sorry, and we protect this pawn with c3. There's a few different moves here, but knight c6 is the main move. Knight f3, bishop d7, or queen b6 is an interesting move, and I actually like to play a kind of funny gambit here. So I can play bishop d3 here, and it might look like black is ready to take this pawn, because, takes takes, and if we take, it looks like we lose our knight, right? But actually, there's a trick here. I don't know if you can spot it. Pause the video if you'd like. But anyway, black cannot do this because they'll lose immediately to bishop b5 check. This is a check. Something has to be done about that, and then no matter what black does, we're going to take the queen and win the game. So, as you can see, that's not possible. For black, anyway. So, what black has to do is they do want to take this pawn, they just can't do it immediately, right? So they play bishop d7. Now that makes sense, right? Now at the end of the line, I don't have this check anymore because the bishop's there. So, I like to play a pretty gambit-y kind of move. And again, when I say gambit, I mean I'm giving something up materially. Material being objectively the pieces on the board. I'm giving up some material for some kind of positional advantage. So I castle, and then often my opponent will say, hey, okay, I've played my bishop here, I can win this pawn, and there doesn't seem to be any problem with that. And in fact, it's not a bad move. So you take, knight takes, queen takes, and as you can see, we don't have this check anymore, and black is threatening to take this pawn. It looks a little weird for white, but actually we have some pretty quick counterplay. So knight c3, and now if black takes the pawn, they're up 2 pawns, which is a lot, but it's actually very dangerous. If they don't play really precisely, they could be in a lot of trouble. So immediately rook e1, attacking the queen, and you'll see that there's a problem along this file. So for example, I've had a lot of games when I was younger where people just didn't notice queen c7 seems natural, but it just totally fails because knight takes d5. Black can't take back because of the pin on the king. And this position is pretty tough to defend for black. Black already has to move the queen. Probably the best move is something like queen b8, but it gets pretty thankless after, let's say, bishop f4 looks pretty nasty. Maybe bishop d2 planning here, or just vacating the bishop really anywhere with the plan of rook c1 and just totally attacking this square with this fork, like we talked about earlier in the video. So I just wanted to kind of start talking about ways of talking about chess, and I hope you enjoyed this little lesson in kind of tidbits and tricks. If there's anything that piqued your interest that you felt like I didn't fully explain well or didn't cover perfectly, I would love for you to leave a comment or feel free to shoot me an email, and maybe I'll touch on it in the next video. Thanks so much. Stay safe.